God, I really am just going to do a video on a game that I've played since like my teenage years. It feels kind of like I'm taking a toy I had as a kid and pulling it apart by like the screws and finding out how it works. It's a little funny, I think. So I played through Amnesia: The Dark Descent in a complete sitting back in October of 2022. More so as a chance to like revisit the game I remember liking a ton. Unlike when I revisited Murdered Soul Suspect, a game that I absolutely hate. I had a good time. I remember Amnesia being one of the scariest things I've played in like the history of anything, because it wasn't a totally jump scare riddled mess that screamed in my face every 2 seconds. It was scary to me because of the atmosphere, because of the sanity system making things hard to tell what was intentionally placed and what was being used to deceive me, because I wasn't able to properly fight back against the things that wanted to kill me. So when I went back to it, I had some pretty high expectations without a doubt. So it was mostly nostalgia, I'm not gonna lie. And seeing how it's mainly a game that people watch versus play, 6 of the 8 achievements I got for my playthrough are rare. And those were released on PC at the start of like 2017, but this video is supposed to be released in 2022 if I get this done in time, and we're going to be talking about the story of Amnesia: The Dark Descent, so warnings are in place now. Play the game yourself or watch a breakdown video, because I'm going to spoil like a good amount of things about the actual story, as usual. So when I streamed The Dark Descent, I laughed half of the time, groaned a quarter of it, and was stressed the rest of the time. So the story of Dark Descent wasn't really anything I could pay full attention to, it being told mainly through like diary scraps that completely stopped the flow of the game, but they're fully voiced, so there is something that helps with the immersion at the very least. Your player character Daniel, the madman, stole a magic little orb and is being chased by a mystic unseen force that this dude who owns a castle named Alexander is able to help fight. He promises to help dispel this shadow that's chasing Daniel, but never truly leaves, it just gets kind of pushed away a little bit. You need the orb to mess with Alexander so he can't reach godhood in one of the endings, and Alexander is from another dimension who's able to talk to you for telepathy, and oh, he's trying to use the orb to get home essentially, but that'll lead to a very bad ending for everybody. One of the biggest plot points I got, because I loved the idea, was that Alexander was collecting this substance called Vitae. I'm googling this. Vitae is what Google says. So the main plot point I got, because I love the idea, you're collecting this substance called Vitae from people who are tormented by his and your own hand. It being an energy source of a sort and a material to prolong life that's produced in human blood under extreme times of stress, aka torture. The interesting thing is that the Amnesia games all share the common Vitae energy source. And when it comes to it, the thing that caught my attention was that the case of the torture, once the person has been tortured to a point of no return, that's where they would give them an amnesia potion. And that's where the amnesia potion Daniel took in the beginning of the game was originally for. It was so the victim could forget the torture and they could harvest more of the Vitae, and they would be able to repeat the process. Vitae, I'm already messing this up. Vitae, like tying a tie, Vitae, Jesus fucking Christ. And with all honesty, for my original playthrough, or I guess rerun of the game, that was really all that I absorbed for the story. But going back, getting some information, Daniel had found the orb, and upon taking it had angered its guardian, the Shadow. He was eventually guided to Alexander, who promised to help him dispel the force, but the ritual was taking longer than expected. In reality, Alexander wanted to keep the Shadow away too, because he wanted to use the orb for his own plans. The Vitae mentioned became the perfect source of energy to power the orb, and while he could get very minimal amounts from wounded animals, humanity is where the real secret of the Vitae laid. Alexander has Daniel kill an innocent man, who Alexander claims is a murderer, in order to perform another ritual that will keep the Shadow at bay. Daniel is roped into the tormenting of these other persons, and while they're simply labeled as criminals, most of them, if not all of them, were innocent. They simply need to be able to be scared enough for Alexander to harvest the Vitae from them. Daniel began to justify his actions as a cleansing of the world, but then he began to take a sadistic glee in his work. The truly realization of his actions came when Alexander and Daniel attacked the family within their dairy farm. The father was killed by Alexander, while the mother and daughter were taken as prisoners. The mother gained access to a hammer and chisel, which she used to let her daughter escape. Daniel was the one to kill the child, but this wasn't an act of cleansing. This was a conscious action done to save his own skin, with Daniel afraid that this kid would report them to the king's guard and let the world know of their misdoings. Alexander began to realize that Daniel was crumbling, and his own guilt and distress was bringing him into a really unstable mental state. So to make sure that nothing would go wrong for himself, Alexander locked himself in his inner sanctum and began to partake in a ritual to open a gate to his other world, one where he could be home, be all-powerful. And Daniel, flying into a rage at Alexander's manipulation of him, Daniel swore revenge. But the thing was, he couldn't bear to keep the memories of his blood rituals, so he drank the very same amnesia potion they used to make their victims forget about their torment, and left a final note to himself for when he'd awaken. And that's where our game begins, Daniel waking up from the effects of the potion and stumbling about the halls. Now, the game itself has 4 endings. 3 of the most common ones are in the last segment when you're confronting Alexander within his inner sanctum. In one of the endings, Daniel can interrupt the ritual completely, and doing so, the shadow forgives him. He's atoned for his sin of stealing the orbs in the beginning, because now it exacts revenge upon Alexander for his attempted use of the orb. In a second ending, Daniel can do absolutely nothing and allow Alexander to complete the ritual and leave through the portal it forms. The shadow in turn kills Daniel for failing to stop Alexander, forcing him to atone for his mistakes. The third main ending, if you took the steps to obtain a fellow named Agrippa's head, the shadow kills both Daniel and Alexander. It requires you to let the portal open and throw Agrippa's head inside to complete the ritual before Alexander can do it for himself. So even though they both died to atone by the shadow's hand, Agrippa, being in the new dimension, begs for Daniel to be helped. His prior pupil Johann Waya resides within this other dimension, having performed the same ritual, just as Alexander had been banished from this world. Agrippa's relieved, and it's assumed that Waya agreed to help. Now, but the secret ending is within a segment where you get captured and set in a cell by the Gatherers, the stalker-type enemies of the game. Instead of escaping, you can actually sit still and let the shadow come and kill you while Alexander taunts you to do so. And then you die in a cell, not very mystical or anything magical. You perish. Although I couldn't really totally wrap my head around the story, either my first or my stream playthroughs, as cool as this all sounds, I was honestly really distracted by evading monsters and trying to find the little secrets, and ending the game with 72 tinder boxes. 72 tinder boxes, 72, Jesus. They really hand those things out like candy on Halloween, jeez. Now, it could also be because of the fact I did a 8-hour-long stream for that game that I wasn't paying full attention while I was going through. I was trying to be, entertaining. But originally, it wasn't ever really the story that was the thing that caught my attention. It was the reactions. It was the gameplay. It was a constant sense of tension it kept for me. The suspension from the noise, design, and fear of the unknown. Speaking of reactions, have you ever heard of this small YouTuber PewDiePie or like this little fella Markiplier? There's no way to ignore the fact that Amnesia's popularity came from laughing at people being scared about it, which I realized saying that I probably had one hell of a stream since I was making fun of the game most of the time. But there's the thing, we've had creators that have helped popularize a flawed game by amping it up and discussing what made it interesting. And with all honesty, The Dark Descent didn't just help shape Let's Plays, it helped shape the entirety of YouTube in my opinion. The puzzles and scares and the experience were able to be shared with some personal flair. We were given another easy form of a content farm for people who wanted to start their creation careers. If the Dark Descent wasn't latched onto by creators as a means of content, we may have never seen it spread as far as it did. We may have never seen the people who were inspired to make their own custom levels. Things like that may have been lost into the vast emptiness of the internet. And I mean, hell, some creators even had custom levels made as a tribute to them. I'm looking at you, Stefano Custom Stories. I remember you. Hell, I made a tweet that described what this script was becoming, and I just posted the image of that golden little statue going, "Do you know his name?" And a handful of people did say Stefano. Say Stefano. And it just goes to show how much of like a lasting influence we're given, even if they were like PewDiePie fans back in that kind of era or whatever. It's long standing. And the Dark Descent was a beautiful little tinderbox that lit up one hell of a spark within a community. It always is impressive to see whatever people come up with for these creators to play through and share. And of course, we still had stories that had no influence in sake of like, oh, I hope this person plays it. Some people just really wanted to share their own story using this game's engine, and that's fucking amazing. I mean, there's even a page on the Amnesia wiki dedicated to some of the more popular custom stories, and one total conversion mod even hit Steam as downloaded like mod you can get off of the Amnesia The Dark Descent store page. It's a fan continuation of the Penumbra series, and even though that series never got as much as attention as The Dark Descent or Amnesia in general, it's still amazing to see that a community-made mod was still featured right there, easy to see. But again, a lot of these stories weren't really played by the majority of the fan base for The Dark Descent. They were watched. Maybe it was because people didn't want to play it themselves, they just wanted to share in the experience. Or the average gamer is just a giant quivering. Dark Descent nearly had about 1,200 mods and add-ons released on ModDB, which seems to be the most common place for uploads. It was a case of only a little over half of them being tagged as full releases, however, but hell, when I was looking at the numbers at the time of writing, there's still some custom story mods under construction. Like, some people are still creating stories 12 years after the game's release. Now, 9 to-be-determined game mods in November and like 5 for December isn't a lot at all, but it's still proof that its impact has a lasting mark. And even with Amnesia Rebirth allowing for custom stories now, the Dark Descent is still the go-to baseline for these stories. Similarly though, at the time of writings, Rebirth's most popular mod is one that makes the pregnant main character's belly big. Okay, let's move on from this. I hate this. Twitch even still has people streaming, and some of them are doing a revisit like I did to see if it's still any good. And when it came to my teenage Crow familiar years, I loved watching YouTubers and discovering new creators through the Dark Descent's custom nights. Custom stories. This isn't fucking Five Nights at Alexander's. I remember predicting the puzzles to see if I was correct in their solutions, and seeing how close the solution was to when it was finally discovered, and trying to predict where the plot was taking us. I wanted the reactions of the creators as they experienced a slow growing dread, and I wanted that tension to be seen in someone else. Does that make me sadistic? And there's nothing wrong with that, wanting to see scares, I mean, or being sadistic, I guess. Okay, anyways, we got to see a ton of wonderful stories and tributes in the height of its popularity. A lot of mod creators made custom stories for either other creators or just for themselves, and they improved upon the current game's design by pushing the engine to its limits, or completely making something original using new assets throughout it. There were so many custom, like, full conversion mods that people just were amazing within. Their stories, their sound design, their own assets, everything came together and made something that was completely new using the existing engine, and that is beautiful. That is what modding should be able to do. It's great. Of course, though, after praising all of this stuff about the custom stories, what about the base game? Again, while its story is intriguing, I really do find the gameplay and the environment to be what really drives it. It finds ways to make you feel vulnerable in its sound design. in its linear map as the shadow chases you down, and through the sanity mechanic. Now, the gameplay in The Dark Descent is way more focused on avoiding the stalker characters, collecting items, and solving puzzles. But honestly, it really is mainly a puzzle game, which is further played up in its Justine DLC. It's also technically a survival horror with an inventory system, the health and sanity management, multiple pieces to puzzles you have to collect. It just doesn't have combat like survival horrors we might think of. I mean, if I say survival horror, what's the first game that comes to mind? Comment that shit below and get some engagement going. And while you're at it, like that video too. And are you subscribed? You should subscribe. Have you heard of Patreon? What about my Twitch? Twitter's going downhill. Follow that anyways. Rolling back into something relevant, the Dark Descent horror is mainly from the sound design and the sense of dread it pushes upon you. The slowly growing tension of knowing the stalkers are somewhere, and maybe not knowing exactly where. It encourages you to play in a dark room, despite hitting you with a fucking flashbang every time you get a flashback. When you give yourself up to the game though, it creates an entrapment within its work. Its environment, the sounds, the pacing, the gross otherworldly flesh creeping through the castle you wander through. There's so many little things that just make the world what it is. And each of these occurrences just drop your endgame sanity further, causing more of them to occur unless you solve the puzzles. It even affects your gameplay with a too high of an insanity, causing your camera to lag when you move your mouse or controller stick, making you take more time to solve puzzles or even move items, or worst of all, navigate through a blurred haze as you're being chased down. And while it kept me tense, while it kept me under its suspense, it wasn't totally enough to keep me completely scared. As much as I love it, I think I must be a bit desensitized to however horror experiences I've had that been. I'm the girl who will play an action horror game and tell the unspeakable terrors to bite the heel of my boot while I go ham on everything I have on hand. But in Amnesia, I can't do that. The most I can do is throw a chair at them, and that barely does anything. But I mean, obviously I'm not impervious. If you let your guard down, you're going to be more vulnerable to the scares. Amnesia wants to make you anxious versus outright scaring you. The game does a great job at making you feel lost, confused, and weak. It wants to unsettle you. It wants to make you feel uncomfortable. It doesn't want you to look directly at the monsters because it increases your insanity, sure, but also because it doesn't want you to know exactly where they are. It wants to hold you within a sense of consistent tension. It doesn't want you to feel like you can let your guard down. It doesn't want you to relax for more than a second. It makes you wonder a little more about what monsters are capable of, which is further escalated when your first stalker enemy is found chopped up in a sewer segment. This horrific force was killed. There has to be something stronger out there than it is. But you don't know where. But you don't know when it's going to show itself. Or if it'll show itself. Which, I mean, it does, and granted it's way creepier, way stronger, and can down Daniel on a single swipe, but you're asked to make your mind wander and wonder what is in the unknown. And honestly, the biggest difference between The Dark Descent and a lot of more recent horror games I've played is that it never really shows every card it has in its hand. I could think I was in a safe area, but I'd still hear the footsteps from a room next to me, making me wonder if I was actually alone. I'd hear something like a man howling in pain, and be stuck wondering if it was my imagination or the stalker enemy had gotten someone else. And with the sanity mechanic, I got a little nervous every time I had to hide in the dark, knowing that it would negatively affect me. It was something that encouraged me to solve puzzles and keep in the light to avoid that potential distortion. The sanity mechanic was something that would impair your gameplay and become a personification of you losing control of yourself. Something that helped build the tension without taking full control away from me. I honestly wish more games would implement a sanity mechanic, maybe Eternal Darkness style, messing with your screen, your audio, and if you're on PC, maybe giving you like a driver error notification. Or on consoles, like more recent ones, it could give you a fake system notification pop-up. Like, how creepy would it be to get an Xbox mail notification and it says some cheesy shit like, "We're watching," just to see nothing in your inbox when you check? So then I got curious and I searched for any more recent series that implemented a sanity system. As of writing, there's this early access game called Winter Survival, very to the point, and seeing how the developers had made games such as Gas Station Simulator, Food Truck Simulator, Treasure Hunter Simulator, I have little faith. Legitimately, it seems like it would be a pretty good, like, solid winter survival simulator. Oh my god, that's such a good title. Why didn't they take that? Winter Survival Simulator. It goes into a good depth when it comes to taking care of yourself with food, water, mental wellness, and physical wellness. The sanity system is affected by the fear of the forest-dwelling threats. Try saying that 10 times fast. Where things like wolves watching you will freak you out. It can cause hallucinations as a first symptom, like seeing a deer that's skinned walking towards you. But those kind of vanish in a puff of green smoke in the demo. They're obviously not part of this world, and I think it doesn't hold as much of an impact. You're not asking if it was real. You're left knowing that it wasn't real, and it doesn't affect the real world at all. But Winter Survival is a survival game first and foremost. It's not focused upon as a horror game. Like, oh, there's American McGee's Alice, not the Madness Returns. That's a sequel to the American McGee's Alice. It had a Senatode that's just a health bar. It's a health bar because, like, Alice is mad. It's her mental sanity. That's her health in the game. Okay, what else does Google tell me? Oh, Green Hell. It's another survival game. This one's set in the Amazon. Fun fact, Winter Survival looks like it's a good survival game because it takes a lot of inspiration from this one. The sanity system here starts at 100% and can drop to 0 from stuff like worms burrowing into your skin, like leeches latching onto you, from insomnia, from parasites, from uncooked foods and dirty water, maybe even like eating human flesh if you're that crazy, that'll dip your sanity. It's gross stuff. A loss of sanity will cause the usual hallucinations, but it also cranks up the volume on your player's inner voice. You start to hear your own self-doubts, your criticisms, the inner voice putting you down for trying to survive. And when it gets really low, everything starts to echo, becomes unclear, it becomes a mess of audio, and then enemies start appearing, but they're only beings of your own imagination that vanish in a puff of smoke. Now, what I hope they do in Winter Survival is what they do in Green Hell here. These hallucinations of the tribal enemies, they can still hurt you. They can cause damage. They can even leave wounds if you're not careful. And some items can even be fake. You could spot a mushroom that you know will help you, but it crumbles to dust as you try to pick it up. So the main difference I find between this and Winter Survival Simulator is that it affects your character. It's something that impairs you as the player without taking full control away. And granted, Winter Survival is in early access at the time I'm making this, and that can change, but it becomes a representation of the character causing harm to themselves, when it's a case of hallucinated enemies causing harm to you. The sanity system doesn't just take some arbitrary number and build tension based on that. It's becoming an active threat by not only overstimulating your senses, but also by giving you active threats. Another sanity system is presented in the game The Suffering, a really cool gem of a game set in a prison break gone monster-filled. The sanity system has a bar that fills as you kill monsters, letting you turn into a monster yourself. Okay, it's just it's a freak out mechanic. It's a Hulk mechanic. God damn it. What about The Sims 2? The aspiration system is their sanity system, and it's related to how happy your sim is or how health. Oh, god damn it. Indigo Prophecy or Fahrenheit in North America. That game was like the start of David Cage's narrative story choice games. That has a sanity system in the place of a mental health mechanic, where if it reaches 0, it's a game. Clock Tower! Their panic meter. Clock Tower's panic meter. It's gotta be more than just a health bar. It's gotta be more than just a health bar. In the third game, it makes your player character harder to control, where she flies into a sprint and can trip over herself and may just stop in her tracks. I mean, if you get hit by a stalker in the state, it's an instant death, so I guess that affects the way that we play in the game dramatically. But any playthroughs I've seen of it, it's been more of an annoyance and something that can help cause tension for the gameplay. It's not a mechanic that helps build that suspense, it just makes it easy for you to die. Okay. What about the other Clock Tower games? They've it's the panic system. It acts like a health bar. It's more so treated like a counter where you're able to fight off the stalker enemy, the Scissorman, when you're in sound mind. But the weaker you get, obviously, the harder it is for you to fight back. And if you don't have enough sanity, if your health is too low, then it's just a one-shot kill. If you run into him, you're dead, and it's just a health bar. Oh, what about Haunting Ground? Haunting Ground, that's considered a classic now. It's got a panic meter. It's reused from Clock Tower 3. It's the same developers. Okay. Alright, so most sanity systems aren't gonna help drive up the tension through making the player question events through their gameplay experience, and most don't impair the player without taking complete control or forcing you into a mechanic. Horror-focused games don't really get the chance to mess with us as a player. I liked the Dark Descent making me really question what was a part of the sanity mechanic and what was intended ambience. I liked Internal Darkness causing panic for its fourth wall-breaking events. The tension that grew as your sanity fell, because you never knew exactly when the game would mess with you. It's just that it would happen more often. And they'd usually trigger when you enter a room, go for a menu, or interact with the environment, so they would thankfully reset the area once the effect was over if it was really intrusive, so it wouldn't completely hinder you, thankfully. But the fourth wall breaks were really what affected player interaction. Imagine going to save your game and being asked instead if you want to erase all your data, and no matter what you picked, it would still do it. Or the panic of opening your inventory just to find every single little item missing. Oh, fun fact by the way, Metal Gear Solid, the Twin Snakes, that was made by the same people as Eternal Darkness, from the developers Silicon Knights. Psycho Mantis has a move where, in that port, he can tilt the screen at and tilts the room. That's a sanity effect from Eternal Darkness. And there's another if the player gets to shoot, or if the player gets Meryl to shoot at the screen, it leaves a bullet hole in your screen. That's a sanity effect too. It's cool little information, isn't it? But most of the games I'm mentioning are still kind of old. Now we have the mainstream horror to get us, but most of what you're going to see, in my opinion, is more of a jump scare fest with good graphics or atmospheric places that don't really take full advantage of their environments. I mean, we still have games like Resident Evil 7 and 8 that were really solid in their design and have their moments, but 8 in particular is still really cheesy in a lot of ways. We have Ethan cracking one-liners throughout and a fucking mech battle, but hear me out, that was still pretty badass. It just doesn't come off as totally scary, but the cheese works with the action focus, and honestly that's how Resident Evil always has been. They do some serious titles, they do some mock B-movie titles where it's focus on action versus focus on suspense, and it's kind of refreshing, I gotta admit. So there's some moments for sure, but compared to 7, it just didn't really hit me as hard when I was watching my friends go through it. I wasn't really ever tense for long periods of time. I'd have that whoa, okay, cool, it's done kind of reaction. 7 really held me a lot more within its horror elements within the Baker House, and something that's been shifted from a normal farmhouse to a trap-riddled place of death. What's a more recent horror game? Scorn released this year, and while its presentation is fantastic, the gameplay kind of feels minimal. The end product was a slow walking sim that was really, really, really gore-filled biomechanical world with some shocking visuals, Mr. Bond, of the gore-filled type. But like an inventory system that's literally poking out of your stomach is a gross idea, but it's a fucking cool one. I've never seen that before. And yeah, it's unsettling, and the organic nature makes your own skin crawl. But as you explore through it, you get used to it. You're constantly exposed to it. The familiarity of these bioorganic systems and how they have or at least you have an idea of how they work. It's where it loses its appeal as a horror game for me. While, yeah, it'll make you uncomfortable, the really good stuff was mostly in the sound design. I wasn't kept tense, I got used to it. Oh, if we wanted to, we can talk about like the mainstream horror games, the ones that are gonna make me sound like a horror hipster. Like, oh no, I only watch horror movies from like the 70s and 80s. Like, get off my dick. Like Five Nights at Freddy's, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Poppy's Playtime, Choo Choo Charles has been really popular lately too. And while these are all fun, most of the appeal is still in the Let's Plays, I find. Five Nights is a pain in the ass to play, but it's wild seeing people go for the custom nights. Tons of creators burst into the community by telling the story theories that they may have, or just by breaking down the existing lore, and creators definitely helped to make it what it is today. Just like The Dark Descent, community's interest in the possibilities helped launch it into the eyes of others, alongside its young audience. The tension is kept for sure, but in those difficult nights, it's not because you're scared. It's not because you're anxious of the possibility of what could be lurking. It's because you need to focus on the game mechanics, and that one small slip-up could be your end. Bendy and the Ink Machine, completely pushed along by the interest of the characters in the story too, I think, and with how weak the action scenes are, honestly. The puzzles are the main meat of the gameplay, while the horror is a secondary thing, and that's okay too. The Dark Descent did the exact same thing, and people were interested in what it had to offer, and people were willing to wait for episodic drops to see what happened next, and because of its young audience's own interest in watching these characters that they liked. There wasn't really a sense of suspense. A lot of the horror came from the inky set pieces and the demonization of a cartoon style. It wasn't a lot of like tension, it was a lot of jump scares from enemies just appearing from ink blots on the floor. Poppy Playtime had their entire NFT and crypto promotion swept under the rug with their second chapter and their Dead by Daylight clone, but they're still pushing on because they know it will sell through the story theories, the lore speculations, and through their characters, and because the community that would keep them popular had a young audience. The scares are cheap, and it's not really... there's no real sense of a long-standing panic. The game tells you when you need to be scared. Part 2 did do a lot better with Mom though, that thing is freaky in its own right. And I mean, hell, Dead by Daylight, mentioned, the top selling under the horror tag in Steam in December 2022, and I get it's got a lot of like horror characters and iconic slashers, but the two scariest things about that game, the first is the expectation that people aren't supposed to be aggressive in gameplay. It's the never-ending meta changes of Killer runs bullshit perk deck, Survivor gets mad, Survivor runs bullshit rush decks, Killer gets mad. It's done out of like revenge instead of trying to find a good way of playing the game. And the amount of times I've seen people going off about how, oh, that killer didn't let me get the hatch. Oh, that survivor was blinding me constantly. Oh, that killer was tunneling me. The killer's supposed to kill, and the survivor's supposed to survive. Both sides of that vocal minority are just kind of entitled. And I get that mechanics can be annoying when abused, but for some, there's that expectation that they won't be used in the first place. Like, we can we keep the running joke up and call them childish too? The second biggest horror quote-unquote element is the homophobia and the toxicity that community brings around, despite the fact that it also brings a huge amount of people from the alphabet mafia into its player base. In this essay, I will tell you why I hate competitive games. Mainstream horror has mostly become a case of what can be scary enough to frighten the players and potentially bring in other communities, but be marketable enough to bring in an income through other means, like children. Think of how many of their grubby little hands got on their parents' credit cards, not only for Robux, but to get that new FNAF Funko Pop that dropped at their mall's Hot Topic. And of course, this isn't saying that teens and young adults and even older adults can't enjoy these medias, but the main appeal is to be appealing enough that parents will look at it and say, oh, that's a cute little thing. I mean, I don't see why little Timmy can't get that for his little collection of the shelf-bound little fucking plastic bits. And obviously I'm still absorbing a lot of my horror opinions through other creators' streams and Let's Plays, even if it's just hearing their opinions to better my own. Kids being introduced to games through creators and streamers they find is nothing new. It's always been a truth, and it's just a fact that everything is so accessible on the internet now that it's so much easier to be seen. The whole intended point here is that the way we perceive horror can be heavily influenced by the creators we watch. But in turn, what becomes popular in horror becomes what's marketable, which sounds kind of stupid saying it out loud, but again, it's just the truth. Media is going to affect how we perceive other media. Because let's be honest, how many of you hated Megamind only to like it after it became a meme? And how people started breaking it down about how it's a genius movie about nature versus nurture? Don't you lie to me. But when you have some creators of young audiences intentionally exposing these teens and younger kinds to these horror materials, those game developers will fall into the trap of making something visually appealing to characters that turn into merch drops. You're going to have softer representations spread along the net through fan arts and drawings. And you're going to have more comedic memes and drawings and videos and just media in general become people's main reception of these games. And a lot of the time it loses what's actually scary about them. I mean, I can't look at Jason from Friday the 13th the same way from the sheer amount of people that I've seen wanting to fuck him. Or even like the original Scream movie. That movie redefined a lot of slasher tropes and made it from a satire to a rewriting of how we should look at them. And the amount of people I've seen this year that were horny over Ghostface are just completely amazing, honestly. I mean, I get it, but it also makes it a lot less scary. but here, if we roll back to Five Nights at Freddy's for a second, I don't think of how a point-and-click horror took a brave jump into 3D survival horror when Security Breach came out. I think of how quickly speedrunners broke it and continued to break it every time it updated, how easy it is to avoid any danger by summoning Freddy. And it's not to say that you can't have a visually appealing or cutesy game and it can't be horrific. I mean, Eve comes to mind with the art theme, the gallery, the childish drawings, the wondrous imagery, only for it to rip the security away from you with its horror elements. It takes those pieces of media that are visually appealing and then flips them on their head to make them hostile. You're always going to have some silly and the scary, and you're going to have the soft renditions for your fan media, but so many of these games have just kind of lost the plot. They don't hold the same suspense. They get you tense, sure, but that rarely lasts. It's like, it's quick, it's done. They're filled with easy jump scares to profit off of the fear reaction and not like the tension or suspense, and it makes it easier for creators to scream a lot so kids will laugh and get attached and buy their merch. But without creators to begin with, would they have gotten anywhere as a series? Amnesia: The Dark Descent is such an important name in the world of horror games because of the influence of creators, because of the way they've shaped the experience, because it was a proof that you could gain fame through screams and funny noises as you play the game. I overall believe it's a game we need more of, and with Amnesia: The Bunker announced, I can only hope it's able to gain a positive spread of popularity. I mean, with how Machine for Pigs and Rebirth apparently formed, that's neither here or there, but within their teaser and the gameplay trailers, it really does feel like they're trying to tackle the fear of the unknown, while keeping timed mechanics present to keep the pressure up. But not to a point like Five Nights where it is a constant mechanic that you have to keep in mind. It hopefully will be something more of a you complete the task, you forget about it, and if you completely forget about it, you're punished for it. My own initial thoughts of the Dark Descent was that it was good because you couldn't fight back. But the Dark Descent is amazing because it's constantly building tension. It never lets you feel safe. And when you do have a safe zone, it gets taken away from you as you progress. The game itself is very linear, which makes it feel like you're constantly running away from this shadow as it takes over more and more of this castle trying to get to you. It keeps you on your toes with the threat of the darkness affecting your sanity and gameplay in turn, making it harder to control your character. It wants you to be generous with your tinderboxes, but you can't go nuts with them because you only have a certain amount. And I know I ended the game with like 72 of them, but when it came to oil, there was always just barely enough there. When I was given a surplus, it was expended as I explored large segments of the area. I never ran out completely, but I was scared to. It kept me on the fence. It never wanted to just jump out at you with its horror. It wanted to keep you anxious. It wanted to keep you on that teetering edge of being calm and being frightened. It's like in a movie when you can tell that it's going to be a jump scare coming up, where you hear that subtle, not even subtle, the ringing in your ears violin, the whirr, as it like pans towards the end of a hallway. That is what the Dark Descent wants to be. It wants to be that build-up. It wants to be that constant sensation that keeps you on your toe, that keeps you on edge, that makes you wait for the jump scare, but the jump scare never comes. It's fantastic. The Dark Descent was just truly a genre-defining game for both game developers and people looking to start with content creation. For me, it's what got me so interested in horror to begin with. And so many horror games now focus on their marketability, their shock scares, their gunplay, their graphics being what creeps you out. The new horror games just haven't hit me the same way as the Dark Descent have. And I can respect their designs, but I can't be scared in the same way. We need to let horror build up their scares without the need of panic response or gory imagery. We can really use the Dark Descent as a wonderful example of what to do in a horror game. And what we don't need is that fucking water monster thing. It perfectly encaptures the fear of the unknown, and I know I fear it. That was a video. We're ending off 2022 with this little tidbit, and this has been my first full year of doing anything content creation wise, and I know I've only gotten a few videos out before the year ended by technicality, so I'm really looking forward to what the new year's bringing. I'm hoping that a lot of you will be able to support me through liking, commenting, subscribing, that bullshittery, the classic engagement protocols. But also, we have the means of like checking out my Twitch, reading the things I write on Twitter, and looking at the art I do, and of course there's the good old Patreon where I get to read out your name if you're in the tier 2 or above. So we also have those aforementioned supporters. From that grouping, we have Vivian Aladrin and Nomadic Raven to thank for their support. So thank you very much. We're going to be going into 2023 with a smile on our face, with some good cocoa, good book, and I hope I see you all within the library in the days to come. Until then, I hope you've had a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, night, whatever the fuck it is in your time zone. And we'll catch each other in the flip side. Do people say that anymore? I'm 25. I'm old as fuck. God damn it. Bye bye.